at 24 years old. Emma Carter owned everything she had left in the world inside a single, worn backpack. 3 months earlier, she had been studying graphic design, working part-time, and sharing a small apartment with 2 friends. Then, a sudden medical emergency drained her savings. The rent fell behind. Her job disappeared. And one bad week quietly became the worst season of her life. By the beginning of autumn, she was sleeping in her aging sedan, showering at a community center, and counting every dollar before buying a meal. Most people passed by without noticing she was homeless. Those who did rarely looked twice. One rainy afternoon, hoping simply to stay dry, Emma wandered into a county surplus auction, where abandoned properties nobody wanted were being sold for unpaid taxes. Rusted sheds, collapsing barns, empty storefronts. Everything seemed forgotten. Then she noticed a small brick building standing by itself at the edge of the lot. Its broken sign barely clung to the wall, but one faded word was still readable. Telegraph. The auctioneer laughed when he saw her staring at it. That old telegraph office? Nobody's touched it in 50 years. It's worth less than the window somebody already stole. No one placed a bid. The room fell silent. Emma looked at the $100 bill folded inside her wallet, the last money she had in the world. Against all reason, she raised her hand. A few people chuckled. One man whispered, "She's homeless, and she just bought a ruin." Emma signed the papers, believing she had probably made the most foolish decision of her life. 2 weeks later, while pulling loose floorboard from the abandoned telegraph office, she uncovered a hidden iron box sealed beneath the operator's desk. Inside were bundles of untouched telegraph messages dating back to the American Civil War. Messages that had never been transmitted, never delivered, and never entered into history. But the greatest mystery wasn't who had written them. It was why someone had risked hiding them beneath the floor instead of sending them when the fate of a nation hung in the balance. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about forgotten American history, hidden family legacies, and ordinary people whose quiet choices changed lives, you're in the right place. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Leave a comment with your city, state, or country. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. If it's morning where you are, I hope you have a wonderful day ahead. If you're listening tonight, I hope this story brings you a little peace before you rest. And if stories like this are your kind of journey, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next forgotten chapter of American history. Now, let's go back to the day Emma Carter lost almost everything, because neither she nor anyone else could have imagined that an abandoned telegraph office bought for just $100 was about to deliver messages that had waited more than 160 years to be heard. Emma Carter never imagined that becoming homeless could happen so quietly. There was no dramatic moment, no single decision that ruined her life. It happened one overdue bill at a time. 6 months earlier, she had been finishing her graphic design degree while working evenings at a neighborhood print shop. She rented a modest apartment with 2 classmates and dreamed of opening her own design studio someday. Then her father suffered a sudden medical emergency. Insurance covered only part of the hospital expenses. Emma emptied her savings to help. She picked up extra shifts, skipped meals, and fell behind in school. When the print shop reduced staff after losing several contracts, her name appeared on the list of layoffs. She searched desperately for another job, but every interview ended with the same polite promise that someone else had been selected. Rent accumulated. Credit cards reached their limits. Her roommates waited as long as they could before admitting they could no longer cover her share. Emma understood. They hugged her goodbye with tears in their eyes. But understanding did not change the fact that she was carrying everything she owned inside 2 duffel bags by the end of the month. Her aging sedan became home. During the day, she parked near libraries where she could apply for jobs using public computers. At night, she chose well-lit parking lots, locked the doors, and tried to convince herself that sleeping in a car was temporary. Every morning, she folded the blanket in the back seat before sunrise so no one would notice. She showered at a community recreation center whenever she could afford the small entrance fee. She counted every dollar before buying groceries. Some afternoons, she wondered whether people walking past her car realized someone lived inside it. Most never looked twice. Emma called her older sister Olivia only once after losing the apartment. Olivia immediately offered a spare bedroom. Emma thanked her but refused. Their relationship had grown strained over the years, partly because Emma hated feeling like the younger sister who always needed rescuing. Olivia insisted the offer carried no conditions. Emma still said no. Hanging up the phone left her feeling guilty. But accepting help felt even harder. She told herself she simply needed one good opportunity, one interview, one paycheck. Then everything would begin moving forward again. Weeks passed. Nothing changed. On a gray Thursday afternoon, rain began falling just as Emma left another unsuccessful interview. She had rehearsed answers all morning, ironed the only professional outfit she still owned, and smiled through every question despite knowing she had barely enough gas to drive across town. The manager thanked her for coming and promised to call. She recognized the look before he even finished speaking. There would be no phone call. Rain streaked across the windshield as she drove aimlessly through unfamiliar streets, trying to decide whether to spend her last few dollars on fuel or food. A handmade sign beside the road caught her attention. County tax auction today. Curious more than hopeful, she followed arrows leading toward an old fairground where people gathered beneath temporary shelters to avoid the rain. She wasn't interested in buying anything. She simply wanted somewhere dry to stand for a little while. The auction featured abandoned sheds, neglected storefronts, weather-damaged barns, and parcels of land that had gone unpaid for years. Most attracted little interest. Emma wandered quietly along the edge of the crowd until she noticed a small brick building sitting by itself beyond the other properties. Ivy climbed one wall. Several windows had been boarded over. A rusted iron bracket still supported the remains of a weathered wooden sign. Only one faded word could still be read. Telegraph. She stepped closer almost without thinking. Unlike the barns and storage buildings surrounding it, the old office possessed a quiet dignity despite its condition. Thick brick walls still stood straight. The front door remained attached. Someone had once cared deeply about the place. The auctioneer noticed her examining it and laughed. "Thinking about that old Telegraph office?" Emma smiled awkwardly. "Just looking." "You'd be the first." A few nearby bidders chuckled. "Roof leaks, windows are gone, wiring's useless. Nobody's wanted that building in decades," another man added. "Costs more to clean than it's worth." Emma nodded politely. Yet something about the lonely building refused to let go of her attention. She imagined the people who had once hurried through those doors, carrying messages that could change lives. Now nobody even bothered looking inside. The auction moved quickly through the remaining properties, until only the Telegraph office remained. "We'll open bidding at $100, the auctioneer announced. Silence answered him. He looked around the crowd. 100. Still nothing. Emma instinctively reached into her jacket pocket. Folded inside her wallet was a single $100 bill she had been saving for emergencies. It represented every dollar she still possessed. Buying an abandoned building made no logical sense. She needed food, gas, a safe place to sleep. Yet as she stared at the forgotten telegraph office, another thought slowly formed. Even if it needed repairs, at least it had walls, a roof. However damaged, still covered part of it. For the first time in weeks, she imagined spending a night somewhere that wasn't the backseat of her car. Before she could reconsider, her hand rose into the air. $100! The auctioneer blinked with surprise before quickly bringing down the gavel. Sold! A ripple of quiet laughter spread through the small crowd. One woman whispered to her husband, "Poor girl doesn't know what she bought." Another man shook his head. "Looks like somebody just purchased a pile of bricks." Emma signed the paperwork with slightly trembling hands. When the clerk handed her the old brass key, it felt strangely heavy. She thanked him, tucked it carefully into her pocket, and walked alone toward the abandoned building while the crowd dispersed behind her. Rain had almost stopped. She unlocked the weathered front door after several stubborn attempts. Hinges groaned loudly as it slowly swung inward. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon light, filtering between cracked boards covering the windows. Broken furniture lay scattered across the wooden floor. An old telegraph counter leaned crookedly against one wall beneath shelves that had long ago collapsed. The room smelled of damp timber and forgotten years. Emma stepped carefully across loose floorboards, imagining how busy the office must once have been. Though neglected, it felt surprisingly solid. She reached the old telegraph operator's desk, positioned near the center of the room. Unlike most of the damaged furniture, it remained firmly anchored to the floor. Curious, she set one hand against its worn surface and shifted her weight. Something beneath the desk answered with a deep, metallic echo, unlike the hollow creak of ordinary wood. Emma frowned. She crouched beside the desk and knocked gently against the floorboards. The same low metallic sound echoed upward from somewhere beneath them. The metallic echo stayed with Emma long after she locked the telegraph office and returned to her car that evening. She parked beneath the same flickering parking lot light where she had slept for nearly 2 weeks. But sleep refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she pictured the old operator's desk and the strange sound beneath its floorboards. She reminded herself that abandoned buildings often hid broken pipes, forgotten storage spaces, or rusted equipment. There was probably nothing unusual beneath the floor at all. Still, curiosity lingered. By sunrise, she had driven to a discount hardware store and spent the last few dollars she had kept separate from the auction money on a pair of work gloves, a pry bar, bottled water, and a cheap broom. If the building was going to become the closest thing she had to a home, it needed cleaning before anything else. The front door opened a little easier the second morning. Emma tied her hair back, opened every window she could force loose, and began carrying years of broken wood, shattered glass, and fallen plaster outside. Dust filled the air despite the fresh breeze moving through the rooms. It was slow, exhausting work, but for the first time in months, she wasn't cleaning someone else's workplace or borrowing someone else's space. Every pile she removed made the building feel a little less abandoned. Shortly before noon, an old pickup truck stopped outside. A man stepped out carrying a toolbox in one hand. He looked around the property before smiling politely. "You're the one who bought this place." Emma straightened, brushing dust from her sleeves. "That's me. Jacob Miller." He extended his hand. "I'm the carpenter working on the church roof down the road." Folks in town said somebody finally bought the old Telegraph office. Emma shook his hand. Emma. Jacob glanced toward the weathered brick walls. She's rough, but the structure's better than it looks. He stepped inside, studying the ceiling and support beams with an experienced eye. Roof needs work, windows too, but these walls aren't going anywhere. Emma laughed quietly. That's encouraging. Jacob pointed toward the floor. Mind if I look around? Please. He spent several minutes examining cracked boards, testing loose beams, and tapping sections of the floor with the handle of his hammer. When he reached the old telegraph desk, he paused. Interesting. Emma looked up. What? These floorboards are newer than the rest. She walked over beside him. How can you tell? Different nails, different wood grain. He crouched for a closer look. Somebody repaired or reinforced this section years after the building was first built. Emma hesitated before mentioning the hollow sound she had heard the previous afternoon. Jacob tapped the floor twice with his hammer. The same deep metallic echo answered from below. His eyebrows lifted slightly. Definitely something under there. What do you think it is? Couldn't say. He stood, but it wasn't built that way by accident. Before leaving, Jacob offered to lend tools whenever she needed them. Nobody likes seeing old buildings disappear, he said, especially ones with history. Emma thanked him sincerely. His kindness surprised her. Most strangers spent little time speaking with someone who looked like she had nowhere else to go. Not long after Jacob drove away, another visitor arrived. An elderly man with neatly combed white hair stepped carefully onto the porch, carrying a leather satchel full of books and folders. "Good afternoon," he called. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Emma smiled. "Not at all." Professor Henry Lawson. He shook her hand warmly. "Retired history department. Word travels quickly in small towns. I heard someone had rescued the old telegraph office." Rescued might be a generous description. He laughed. History usually survives because generous people do unreasonable things. Emma invited him inside. The professor slowly walked through the building, occasionally brushing dust from brickwork or examining old iron fixtures still attached to the walls. He paused beside the telegraph desk. "Remarkable," he murmured. "This was probably the operator's station." Emma asked if much was known about the building. Professor Lawson frowned thoughtfully. "Very little. We know messages passed through here during the Civil War years. After that, records become surprisingly sparse." "No explanation?" "None that I've ever found." His eyes wandered across the room. "Sometimes history leaves empty spaces." After Professor Lawson departed, Emma returned to the reinforced floor beneath the telegraph desk. She first removed the heavy desk itself with considerable effort. Inch by inch across the floor, until the reinforced boards lay fully exposed. Unlike the surrounding planks, they fit together unusually tightly. She slid the pry bar beneath one edge and carefully applied pressure. The old nails resisted before finally giving way with a loud creak. One board lifted. Beneath it lay another layer of timber. Her heartbeat quickened. Someone had intentionally sealed whatever rested below. She removed a second board, then a third. Dust rose into the afternoon sunlight as the final plank came free. Underneath sat a rectangular iron lockbox fitted neatly between heavy support beams. Its dark metal surface was covered in rust, but remained remarkably solid. Emma knelt beside it in silence. The box had been deliberately hidden beneath the operator's desk, where nobody would casually disturb it. There was no visible lock, Only a rusted latch held the lid shut. Unsure what else to expect, she slipped the pry bar beneath the latch and gently pressed downward. Rust cracked. The lid slowly lifted with a groan that echoed through the empty office. Inside lay dozens of carefully bundled telegraph forms tied together with faded cloth ribbon. Emma stared without moving. Every bundle appeared dry despite decades beneath the floor. She carefully lifted the first stack into the light. The paper had yellowed with age, but the printed telegraph forms remained clear. Handwritten messages filled each page in neat ink. At the bottom of every form, where receiving offices normally marked successful transmission, the space remained blank. None had been officially received. None had been transmitted. A strange feeling settled over her. These weren't random papers forgotten beneath the floor. Someone had carefully hidden them before anyone else could read them. Remembering Professor Lawson, Emma reached for her phone and called the number he had written on the back of one of his business cards before leaving. Less than an hour later, he hurried through the front door carrying white cotton gloves and a magnifying glass. The moment he saw the bundles spread carefully across the old desk, he stopped speaking altogether. He slowly picked up one form while wearing the gloves, studying the faded ink beneath the afternoon light. Several long minutes passed before he finally looked at Emma. "These appear authentic," he whispered. "If they are genuine." He stopped, seemingly unable to finish the thought. Together they carefully examined several more telegrams without changing their order. Dates placed them during the Civil War. Military routing marks appeared exactly where Professor Lawson expected to find them. Yet every transmission line remained incomplete. "I've studied telegraph records for 40 years, he said quietly. "I've never seen a collection like this." Emma reached carefully toward the final bundle resting at the bottom of the lockbox. One sheet had been folded separately from all the others. Unlike the remaining forms, someone had written a short sentence across the bottom margin in darker ink. Professor Lawson leaned closer as Emma gently unfolded the page. Together they read the handwritten words, "Do not send unless truth survives." Professor Lawson remained inside the telegraph office until sunset, carefully photographing every bundle before either of them touched another page. His excitement never overwhelmed his caution. Each telegram was placed in the exact order it had been found, and every detail was recorded before the lockbox was temporarily sealed again. "History only gets one chance to preserve evidence properly," he said while labeling another photograph. Emma watched him work. Just a week earlier, she had been struggling to find enough money for dinner. Now she was helping document Civil War telegrams hidden beneath an abandoned telegraph office. The change felt almost impossible to understand. Before leaving, Professor Lawson made several phone calls to colleagues at nearby universities and state archives. None of them could immediately explain the discovery. One specialist confirmed that authentic Civil War telegraph forms were uncommon, but not unheard of. Another admitted he had never encountered a hidden collection that appeared untouched since the 19th century. "Whatever these are," Professor Lawson said after ending the final call, "they deserve patience." Emma nodded. "I'll keep everything exactly where it is." "Good." He smiled kindly. "Sometimes the greatest discoveries are ruined by people moving too quickly." That evening, Emma spread an old sleeping bag across one corner of the office where rain no longer reached through the repaired section of roof. The building still had no electricity or running water, but compared with sleeping inside her car, the telegraph office already felt strangely comforting. Thick brick walls muffled the night wind. For the first time in weeks, she slept indoors. The next morning, Professor Lawson returned carrying archival sleeves, cotton gloves, and several history books illustrating Civil War telegraph networks. Together, they began cataloging the telegrams one by one without opening the folded groups more than necessary. Emma noticed a pattern almost immediately. These dates don't match. Professor Lawson adjusted his glasses. She pointed toward 3 different forms. One had been written in early May, another in June, another several weeks later. They weren't all written at the same time. The professor compared additional pages before slowly nodding. You're right. They continued examining more telegrams. The pattern repeated throughout the collection. Weeks sometimes passed between the dates, yet every message had been hidden together inside the same lockbox beneath the floor. Whoever placed these here kept adding to them, Emma said quietly. Exactly. Professor Lawson looked thoughtful. This wasn't one forgotten shipment. Someone deliberately collected these messages over several months. The realization changed everything. The hidden box had not been used in panic. It had been used repeatedly. Someone had returned again and again, carefully placing new telegrams inside while leaving the earlier ones untouched. Emma looked around the silent office. They must have expected to come back. Professor Lawson did not answer immediately. Instead, he opened another archival folder and carefully compared routing marks, transmission numbers, and dates. Every unanswered question seems to create another. During the afternoon, Emma visited the county library, hoping to learn more about the building itself. Old newspapers mentioned the telegraph office only briefly, usually in reports about stagecoach schedules or railroad expansion. None referred to hidden telegrams or unusual events. A local history volume listed several telegraph operators who had worked in the region, but one name appeared only once before disappearing completely. Samuel Brooks. There was no biography, no explanation. Simply a short notation identifying him as the operator assigned to the office during part of the Civil War. Emma copied the page before returning to the telegraph office. Professor Lawson studied the name thoughtfully. Interesting. Have you heard of him? No. That's what troubles me. Why? Telegraph operators kept essential communications moving during the war. Most left at least some record behind. He tapped the page gently. Samuel Brooks seems to vanish. As they organized additional telegrams, a familiar car pulled into the gravel lot outside. Emma recognized it immediately. Olivia stepped out carrying 2 grocery bags. The sisters looked at one another awkwardly before Olivia smiled. I brought sandwiches. Emma laughed softly. That's one way to make sure I don't refuse your help. Olivia walked inside, taking in the dusty room, the repaired windows, and stacks of carefully labeled archival boxes. This is where you've been living? For now. Olivia looked concerned, but said nothing about Emma's decision. Instead, she set the food on the old counter. Professor Lawson introduced himself and briefly explained the discovery beneath the floor. Olivia listened politely, though skepticism remained on her face. So, my little sister accidentally bought a Civil War mystery. Emma shrugged. Apparently. They shared lunch together inside the quiet office. Conversation remained cautious at first. Olivia admitted she had worried constantly since Emma refused to move into her spare bedroom. Emma confessed she had been embarrassed more than anything else. I didn't want you thinking I couldn't stand on my own. Olivia looked at her sadly. Needing help doesn't make you weak. Emma stared at her untouched sandwich for several moments before quietly replying, I know. I just forgot that for a while. The conversation might have become uncomfortable if Professor Lawson had not interrupted with another discovery. He had spread several telegrams across the desk, according to their transmission dates. "Come look at this." Both sisters joined him. "Notice anything unusual?" Olivia leaned closer. Unlike Emma, she had never studied historical documents, yet one detail immediately stood out. "The dates keep jumping." "Exactly," Professor Lawson replied. "These messages weren't hidden after one single event. Someone gathered them little by little." Emma nodded. "Over months." "Which means the lockbox remained accessible throughout that period." Olivia frowned. "So whoever hid them expected nobody else would find it." The professor smiled. "A very reasonable conclusion." As daylight faded, they carefully returned the telegrams to the iron box in their original order. Emma prepared to replace the temporary protective covering over the opening beneath the floor when something caught her attention. A narrow strip of dark leather protruded from the edge of the empty compartment where the lockbox had rested. "Wait." She knelt beside the opening. "There's something else." Professor Lawson handed her a flashlight. The leather object appeared wedged tightly beneath one of the supporting beams. Emma reached carefully inside and worked it loose inch by inch until it finally slid free. Dust covered every surface, but the shape was unmistakable. It was a small leather-bound journal, wrapped in faded oilcloth. Olivia looked from the journal to the empty compartment. "That wasn't inside the box." "No," Emma replied. "It was hidden underneath it." Professor Lawson carefully unfolded the brittle wrapping with gloved hands. The cover had cracked with age, yet remained surprisingly intact. He slowly opened the first page. Written in neat, confident handwriting across the inside cover was a single name: Samuel Brooks. None of them spoke. Emma turned the page and saw the first lines of a journal that had remained hidden beneath the telegraph office floor for more than a century. Professor Lawson carried Samuel Brooks's journal to the old telegraph desk as though he were holding something far more fragile than paper. Emma gently cleared away the remaining dust, while Olivia closed the front door to keep the afternoon breeze from disturbing the brittle pages. The room fell quiet, except for the distant tapping of rain against the boarded windows. The first page contained only a single sentence beneath Samuel's name. "If these pages are ever read, let them explain what official records never will." Professor Lawson slowly exhaled. "He expected to be misunderstood." Emma nodded without taking her eyes off the faded handwriting. She recognized something painfully familiar in that first sentence. She knew what it felt like when strangers formed opinions without knowing the full story. Carefully turning the page, Professor Lawson began reading aloud. Samuel's earliest entries described the telegraph office during ordinary days, before fear found its way into every message. He wrote about opening the station before sunrise, checking battery connections, cleaning brass instruments, replacing worn wire, and waiting for the steady rhythm of incoming signals. His work demanded precision because every mistake carried consequences beyond the office walls. "He loved this place," Emma observed quietly. Professor Lawson smiled. "You can always tell when someone writes about work they believe matters." Samuel described travelers stopping for directions, merchants waiting anxiously for business news, families hoping for letters from distant relatives, and railroad workers depending on accurate communications. He never portrayed himself as important. Instead, he repeatedly wrote that the messages mattered far more than the operator sending them. Olivia looked around the abandoned office with new appreciation. "It's strange," she whispered, standing here while reading words written in this very room. As they continued, another name appeared frequently throughout the journal: Clara. Samuel referred to her as his younger sister, 14 years old, who often spent afternoons helping clean the office after finishing lessons. She organized supplies, copied routine records, and proudly learned the Morse alphabet by listening to the clicking sounder. One passage made Emma smile. Clara insists she can recognize my mistakes before I do. She is usually correct, which is terribly inconvenient for an older brother. Olivia laughed softly. That sounds familiar. Emma glanced toward her sister with a smile neither of them had shared in months. Only because you always think you're right. Usually. The brief moment of laughter faded as Professor Lawson turned several more pages. Samuel's tone gradually changed. Daily routines gave way to growing uncertainty. More military traffic began flowing through the office. Civilian messages often waited while official dispatches received priority. Samuel accepted the extra work without complaint. Yet he increasingly mentioned small inconsistencies that troubled him. Today's orders reached us carrying corrections that should never have existed. One entry read. Another, several days later, stated, a destination changed after transmission without explanation. Professor Lawson adjusted his glasses. Interesting. Emma looked up. Why? Telegraph messages followed strict procedures. Unexplained alterations were unusual. Samuel continued recording similar incidents. Some military telegrams arrived with words crossed out and replaced before transmission. Others carried signatures he did not recognize. None of the changes seemed dramatic alone, yet together they formed a pattern that Samuel clearly found unsettling. He never accused anyone directly. Instead, he carefully documented dates, message numbers, and observations. Almost like he wanted evidence, Emma said. Exactly, Professor Lawson replied. Olivia leaned closer as another entry caught her attention. An officer instructed me not to question. Amended wording. He smiled while saying it, which troubled me more than anger would have. Emma frowned thoughtfully. He knew something was wrong. He suspected it, Professor Lawson corrected gently. Suspicion and proof are very different. The journal never described open conflict. Instead, Samuel repeatedly expressed concern that certain official telegrams no longer matched information arriving through civilian channels. Reports from travelers contradicted military notices. Messages warning of danger sometimes disappeared entirely. Others appeared carrying details Samuel believed had been altered after leaving their original senders. Every entry remained calm, factual, and careful. The more they read, the more Emma trusted him. People inventing dramatic stories rarely documented ordinary days with such patience. Samuel recorded broken telegraph wires, bad weather, equipment failures, and routine deliveries alongside the troubling inconsistencies. Nothing felt exaggerated. Late that afternoon, Jacob Miller stopped by carrying replacement boards for one broken window. Seeing the open journal, he quietly asked what they had discovered. Professor Lawson summarized only the confirmed facts before returning to the next page. Jacob listened respectfully while repairing the damaged frame without interrupting. Another journal entry drew everyone's attention. A gentleman wearing government credentials visited today. He asked unusual questions about transmission logs, but showed little interest in whether messages reached their destinations. Clara noticed his hands shaking after he believed we had stopped watching. Olivia looked toward Professor Lawson. Do official records mention this visitor? Not that I've ever found. Emma noticed Samuel never identified the man by name. He simply continued documenting each unusual encounter without speculation. Days later, another entry appeared. Certain dispatches now arrive already carrying corrections. I have begun keeping private notes, should memory someday fail where ink succeeds. Professor Lawson tapped the margin thoughtfully. That explains why he wrote everything down. Emma slowly looked around the old office again. Samuel had been standing exactly where she now stood, while struggling to understand whether something dishonest was unfolding around him. Yet history remembered almost nothing about him. As evening approached, the journal entries became shorter. Samuel wrote less about routine operations and more about growing unease. Clara continued appearing throughout the pages, bringing food, organizing records, and encouraging her brother to rest when long hours left him exhausted. Their relationship filled the journal with warmth, even as tension slowly increased. Emma found herself unexpectedly attached to two people she knew only through fading handwriting. Finally, Professor Lawson turned to the last completed page. Unlike earlier entries, the handwriting appeared slower, as though every word had been chosen carefully. Samuel wrote only a single paragraph. The messages waiting upon my desk carry consequences beyond the wires themselves. Tonight, I must decide which message should never be sent. The page ended there. The next sheet remained completely blank. Emma woke before sunrise with Samuel Brooks's final journal entry still echoing in her thoughts. Tonight I must decide which message should never be sent. She read the sentence several more times while Professor Lawson carefully stored the journal inside an archival sleeve. It wasn't simply the decision that troubled her. It was the loneliness behind it. Samuel had clearly understood that whatever choice he made would likely be judged by people who never witnessed the circumstances surrounding it. Emma quietly folded her blanket inside one corner of the Telegraph office before Olivia arrived carrying coffee and breakfast sandwiches. Unlike previous visits, Olivia no longer looked at the building as though it were a mistake. She glanced around the room with genuine curiosity. "What's the plan today?" Professor Lawson answered before Emma could. "The telegrams." He spread several copied records across the old telegraph desk. "We've learned a great deal about Samuel. Now we need to learn about the people his messages were meant to reach." Together, they began organizing the hidden telegrams according to names, destinations, and dates. Many referred to military offices that no longer existed. Others were addressed to county officials or railroad stations long abandoned. But mixed among them were messages directed toward ordinary families whose surnames still appeared in local records. Emma noticed one family name repeating several times: Harper. Professor Lawson checked county archives he had borrowed from the Historical Society. Interesting. There are still Harpers living less than 20 miles from here. Olivia smiled. That's our first stop. Before leaving, Emma carefully placed one copied telegram inside a protective folder. None of them wanted to disturb the original documents more than necessary. The drive to the Harper farm took less than an hour. Rolling fields surrounded a weathered farmhouse where an elderly couple welcomed the unexpected visitors onto their porch. Emma introduced herself and briefly explained the discovery of the hidden Civil War telegrams. At first, the couple exchanged uncertain glances. Then Professor Lawson mentioned the name Elijah Harper. The older man slowly straightened. "My great-great-grandfather." Emma carefully handed him the protected copy of the telegram. The message itself had never been transmitted. It ordered local authorities to seize property belonging to Elijah Harper on suspicion of aiding Confederate sympathizers. The elderly man stared silently at the faded handwriting before looking toward the distant fields. "Our family always believed the government intended to take this farm," he said quietly. "But nobody ever understood why nothing happened." Professor Lawson spoke gently. "This message was never sent." The old farmer nodded slowly. "Then perhaps that's why we're still standing here." He folded the copy with remarkable care. "My grandfather used to say, 'Someone must have shown mercy. We never knew who.'" During the drive back, Emma remained unusually quiet. One undelivered telegram had changed the course of an entire family's history. She wondered how many others inside the lockbox carried similar consequences. The following day, another message led them to descendants of the Bennett family. This telegram warned local officials that Confederate raiders might target a settlement farther south. Because it remained unsent, the warning never officially reached its destination. Yet family records revealed something unexpected. The Bennetts had left the settlement several days before the reported attack after receiving an unexplained private warning from an unknown traveler. Maybe Samuel found another way, Olivia suggested. Professor Lawson considered the possibility without answering. The pattern continued. Every recovered telegram seemed connected to questions families had carried through generations. One message concerned disputed property rights that historians had long considered clerical mistakes. Another named civilians mistakenly suspected of helping enemy forces. Several referred to ordinary people rather than soldiers. None appeared random. Emma gradually realized Samuel had not hidden meaningless paperwork. He had hidden decisions capable of changing countless lives. As more descendants agreed to meet, Emma found herself speaking with strangers who quickly became deeply invested in forgotten history. She listened as elderly grandchildren repeated stories they had heard since childhood without ever knowing whether they were true. Some cried while holding copies of messages their ancestors had waited a lifetime to receive. Others simply thanked Emma for caring enough to search beyond the abandoned walls everyone else ignored. Between meetings, Olivia quietly watched her younger sister. "You're different," she finally said while helping organize another group of copied telegrams inside the office. Emma looked up. "Different how?" "You don't seem lost anymore." Emma smiled faintly. "Maybe because for the first time in months, I wake up knowing what needs to be done." Olivia nodded. "I missed seeing you like this." Emma hesitated before answering. "I missed me too." Their conversation drifted naturally after that. They spoke about childhood memories, their parents, college, and the months they had spent barely calling one another. Neither apologized directly. Neither needed to. Working side by side inside the old Telegraph office quietly repaired conversations that had been broken for years. Late one afternoon, Professor Lawson returned carrying additional county records. "I may have found another descendant connected to Samuel's messages." The address led them to a modest white farmhouse where an elderly woman named Margaret Ellis welcomed them inside after hearing why they had come. Emma carefully explained the discovery before showing her a copied telegram mentioning Margaret's great-grandfather. The woman studied the faded writing for several moments before closing her eyes. "I've heard this name my entire life," she whispered. The telegram accused her great-grandfather of providing supplies to Confederate scouts and instructed local authorities to detain him pending investigation. Professor Lawson quietly explained that the message had never been transmitted. Margaret slowly shook her head. "Then history has been telling only half the story." She walked toward an old wooden cabinet and removed a faded family Bible. Tucked between its pages rested a handwritten note passed through generations. She carefully unfolded it before handing it to Emma. "My grandmother always said our family survived because someone at the telegraph office refused to send a message." Emma felt her heart begin beating faster. "Did she ever say who?" Margaret smiled gently through gathering tears. "Only one name." She looked directly at Emma. "Samuel Brooks." Silence settled across the room. Professor Lawson lowered his eyes. Olivia reached quietly for her sister's hand. Margaret folded the old family note once more before speaking the words that had survived in her family for more than a century. Samuel Brooks saved my great-grandfather.
Margaret Ellis's words stayed with Emma throughout the drive back to the Telegraph office.
No one spoke for several miles. The fading afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the empty highway, while each of them quietly considered the same possibility. Samuel Brooks had not simply withheld messages. He had protected real families whose descendants were still alive more than a century later.
When they reached the office, Professor Lawson carefully added Margaret's family note to the growing collection of documented oral histories.
"One account alone proves very little," he said as he filed the copy. "Several independent accounts that agree with one another begin to form evidence." Emma looked around the old room that had once seemed like nothing more than a forgotten ruin. Every day it revealed another piece of a story history had nearly erased. "Then let's keep looking." Over the following week, more descendants agreed to meet after learning about the recovered telegrams. Some arrived carrying faded family Bibles, handwritten letters, or old photographs passed from one generation to the next. Others brought nothing except stories they had heard since childhood. Though each family remembered different details, one theme appeared again and again. Samuel Brooks had quietly warned civilians whenever danger approached. One elderly rancher recalled a story his grandmother repeated every winter. She claimed an unknown telegraph operator urged several families to leave their homes before soldiers arrived searching for suspected collaborators. At the time, no one understood why the warning came. They simply trusted it. Another family described how an ancestor traveling west unexpectedly changed routes after receiving private advice from a telegraph operator who insisted the main road was no longer safe. The official explanation had always been bad weather. Family tradition remembered something very different. Professor Lawson carefully compared every account with Samuel's journal and the hidden telegrams. Whenever dates matched, he marked them with small colored tabs. By the end of the week, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. Samuel repeatedly delayed or withheld official communications, while innocent civilians quietly disappeared from locations later searched by military patrols. "He wasn't helping one family," Emma said softly. "He was protecting anyone he believed might be harmed." Olivia nodded, "Even knowing people might blame him." Professor Lawson looked thoughtfully toward Samuel's journal. "History often remembers broken systems more clearly than the people who quietly prevented greater tragedies." Emma spent each morning cleaning and repairing another small section of the building before research began. Jacob Miller continued stopping by whenever work allowed, bringing scrap lumber, replacement hinges, and practical advice. One afternoon, he helped reinforce part of the porch while Emma sanded an old window frame. "Funny thing," Jacob said, tightening another bolt. "Folks around town have started calling this place yours." Emma smiled. "It still feels strange hearing that. Home usually does at first." She paused for a moment. No one had called anywhere home in months. The word settled warmly inside her without her expecting it. That afternoon, Professor Lawson hurried into the office carrying several photocopied military reports borrowed from the state archives. His usual calm expression had been replaced by unmistakable excitement. "I think I found what Samuel was trying to tell us." Emma and Olivia gathered around the desk. The reports described communications failures during the same months covered by Samuel's journal. At first glance, they seemed routine. Delayed transmissions, missing dispatches, equipment problems. But Professor Lawson pointed towards several handwritten annotations added by later investigators. "Look here." Emma leaned closer. One report questioned why multiple military orders identifying suspected Confederate collaborators never reached receiving offices. Another referenced growing concerns that altered information had appeared in several official dispatches before transmission. Olivia frowned. "Altered?" Exactly. Professor Lawson laid Samuel's journal beside the reports.
Remember his repeated observations about corrected wording?
Emma nodded immediately. He kept writing that certain messages had been changed. These reports suggest he wasn't imagining it. They spent hours comparing dates, again and again. Samuel's private notes aligned with documented military confusion. Telegraph messages had indeed been altered before reaching destination offices.
Officials at the time never determined how or why. Samuel had noticed the same irregularities months earlier.
He knew something was wrong, Emma whispered. He just couldn't prove it. Professor Lawson nodded slowly. And if he believed innocent civilians would suffer because of those altered messages, he left the sentence unfinished. No one needed to complete it.
They already understood why Samuel's decision had become so impossible.
Emma looked toward the carefully preserved telegram reading, "Do not send unless truth survives." For the first time, the message no longer sounded mysterious. It sounded like a desperate instruction from someone trapped between duty and conscience. As evening approached, Jacob finished repairing the porch before joining them inside. Emma briefly explained Professor Lawson's discovery. Jacob listened quietly before looking toward the hidden lockbox beneath the floor. So history called him a man who failed his job? Yes, Professor Lawson replied, when he may have been trying to save innocent people instead. Jacob slowly shook his hand. That's a heavy price.
Emma thought about her own life over the previous months. Losing her apartment had made strangers assume she had somehow failed.
Few ever asked how quickly circumstances could overwhelm someone trying their best. Samuel's story felt painfully familiar. Sometimes the world judged outcomes without ever seeing the impossible choices behind them. Before locking the office for the night,
Emma decided to continue cleaning the rear storage room that had remained untouched since buying the property.
Most of it contained broken shelving and collapsed crates. While moving one of the heavier cabinets away from the wall, she noticed an unusual gap behind it. The brick itself looked ordinary,
but one narrow wooden panel fitted between two support posts seemed newer than everything surrounding it.
"Professor?" she called. He joined her carrying a flashlight. After examining the panel, he looked at Emma with quiet curiosity. "This doesn't belong to the original construction." Jacob gently tapped the wood with the handle of his hammer. Instead of solid resistance,
a hollow sound answered from somewhere inside the wall.
Emma carefully slid the pry bar beneath the edge. The old nails loosened with surprising ease, as though someone had wanted the panel removed without damaging it. Slowly, the narrow board lifted away. Behind it rested a shallow cavity lined with rough timber.
Dust covered everything inside, except a small cloth bundle tucked carefully into the corner.
Emma reached in and lifted it out with both hands. The fabric had faded almost white with age, but it remained tightly wrapped around something no larger than a school notebook. Professor Lawson carefully untied the worn cord, while Olivia held the flashlight steady.
Inside rested a small notebook with a cracked blue cover, noticeably smaller than Samuel's journal.
Across the first page, written in youthful handwriting, appeared a single familiar name: Clara Brooks.
Professor Lawson placed Clara Brooks's notebook inside a protective sleeve before opening the first page.
Unlike Samuel's careful handwriting, Clara's script was youthful and energetic, though surprisingly neat. Across the top, she had written a single sentence: "Samuel says every message matters because every family matters." Emma smiled faintly. Even before reading further,
she could already hear the affection Clara held for her older brother.
The earliest entries described ordinary days inside the Telegraph office.
Clara wrote about polishing brass telegraph keys, sweeping the floor before travelers arrived, carrying fresh water from the nearby well, and practicing Morse code until Samuel finally admitted she could copy messages nearly as quickly as he could. She often complained about dust, laughed about stray chickens wandering inside, and teased her brother for forgetting to eat whenever the telegraph sounder became busy. She adored him, Olivia whispered. Professor Lawson nodded, and she wanted to remember the ordinary days. Emma quietly understood why. When difficult times arrive, ordinary memories often become the ones people fear losing most. Several pages later, Clara's cheerful tone slowly changed. She noticed Samuel spending longer evenings comparing telegrams before transmission. She wrote that he had begun keeping private notes hidden beneath his desk because some messages no longer look the way they arrive. Unlike Samuel, Clara admitted she did not understand the problem completely. She only knew her brother had become worried. One evening she found him sitting alone after midnight. He told me that doing the right thing sometimes means disappointing the wrong people, she wrote. I asked how to know who the wrong people are. He said that is the hardest question a person will ever answer. Emma looked up from the page. He was trying to protect her, too. Professor Lawson nodded quietly. Clara continued describing unfamiliar officials visiting the office more frequently. She noticed Samuel becoming increasingly careful about recording every incoming transmission before forwarding it. More than once, she wrote that he copied certain telegrams by hand after everyone else had gone home. He was gathering evidence, Olivia said softly. Yes, Professor Lawson replied. He believed one day someone would need to know what truly happened. As they read further, the notebook finally reached the weeks described in Samuel's own journal. Clara explained that several military dispatches named ordinary farming families as Confederate collaborators, even though local travelers insisted those families had helped Union soldiers and refugees. Samuel compared conflicting reports night after night until he became convinced some telegrams had been deliberately altered before reaching his office. Clara never claimed to understand who changed them. She only understood her brother's growing fear that innocent people would suffer if every message continued traveling unchecked. One entry made the room completely silent. Samuel cried tonight. I have only seen him cry once before when Father died. He said if he obeys the telegraph, families may lose everything. If he disobeys, history will say he failed his duty. Emma slowly closed her eyes. She remembered sleeping inside her car, wondering how quickly strangers judged someone without ever asking what impossible choices had come first. Samuel had faced a burden far greater than losing a job. He had been forced to choose between official orders and innocent lives. Clara described the night Samuel finally acted. Together they removed several telegram bundles from the operator's desk after sunset. Samuel carried them beneath the loose floorboards while Clara held the lantern. He said these messages must sleep until someone can prove the truth, she wrote. He told me delayed words are kinder than false ones that cannot be called back. Emma glanced toward the iron lockbox now resting safely inside its archival case. The hidden telegrams had never been forgotten. They had been deliberately protected. Clara explained that Samuel intended to continue gathering evidence before presenting everything to higher authorities once he possessed enough proof. Instead, illness spread through nearby settlements. Within days, Samuel developed a severe fever. At first, he insisted it was only exhaustion. Soon, he could barely stand beside the telegraph desk. Clara cared for him inside the office while continuing to hide the remaining telegrams exactly where he instructed. He kept asking whether the box was still hidden, she wrote, even when he could hardly speak. He remembered the families before himself. Several pages later, the handwriting became shakier. Samuel never recovered. Clara wrote only a few heartbreaking lines about watching neighbors carry her brother away, hoping a doctor farther east might save him. He died before reaching medical care. Emma quietly lowered her head. Samuel had accepted being remembered as a failed telegraph operator without ever receiving the opportunity to explain why. Clara's final entries described the lonely weeks that followed. She remained inside the telegraph office as long as she could, protecting both Samuel's journal and the hidden telegrams exactly as he had instructed. Eventually, relatives arrived to take her away. Before leaving, she concealed her own notebook inside the wall cavity where Emma had discovered it. "If nobody believes Samuel now," she wrote, "perhaps someone kinder will believe him someday." Olivia wiped away a tear before turning the final page. Tucked inside the back cover rested a folded sheet of paper. Professor Lawson carefully unfolded it across the desk. It was a hand-drawn map showing the telegraph office, an old country road, a small church, and a cemetery marked by several simple crosses. One cross had been circled in darker ink. Beneath it, Clara had written only a few words. "Samuel rests here. There is no proper stone. I pray someone remembers him." Emma stared silently at the faded map. More than 160 years earlier, a younger sister had trusted that one day a stranger would care enough to finish the promise she could not keep. Emma folded Clara's hand-drawn map with extraordinary care before placing it inside a protective sleeve. None of them spoke for several moments. Samuel Brooks had spent his final days worrying that innocent families would suffer because of altered telegrams. Clara had spent the rest of her childhood protecting the truth he left behind. Now, after more than 160 years, that truth had finally found someone willing to finish the story. Professor Lawson compared Clara's map with modern county survey records and several 19th-century church registries. Although roads had shifted over the decades, one landmark remained unchanged. An old cemetery outside a vanished farming settlement still appeared in county records. "I believe this is where she meant," he said quietly. Jacob leaned over the table. "I know that road. Hardly anyone uses it anymore." The following morning, the four of them drove together before sunrise. Emma rode silently beside Olivia, while Professor Lawson held Clara's map across his lap. Jacob guided them along increasingly narrow gravel roads until the pavement disappeared altogether. Sagebrush covered both sides of the trail, and abandoned fence posts leaned at odd angles beneath the desert wind. Eventually, Jacob slowed beside a weathered iron gate standing half open. "This is as far as we drive," he said. They continued on foot through waist-high grass toward a small, forgotten cemetery where many of the oldest markers had collapsed or disappeared entirely. Clara's map showed a large cottonwood tree standing near the western fence line. The tree itself had died decades earlier, but its enormous stump remained, its roots still gripping the earth. Professor Lawson unfolded the map again. "Samuel's grave should be just beyond this." Emma carefully stepped between worn headstones whose inscriptions had long faded away. A slight rise beneath the grass caught her attention. Several stones formed a rough rectangle almost hidden beneath years of drifting soil. There was no standing marker, only the broken remains of a wooden stake lying flat against the ground. Kneeling carefully, Emma brushed away loose dirt with her hands. Faint carved letters slowly emerged from the weathered wood. "Amuel." Olivia quietly covered her mouth. Professor Lawson removed his hat. "We found him." No one spoke. The morning breeze moved gently through the cemetery, while Emma looked down at the simple resting place of a man history had nearly erased. Samuel Brooks had protected strangers who never knew his name, accepted disgrace he did not deserve, and died before anyone could hear his explanation. Clara had trusted that someday another stranger would care enough to find him again. Emma softly placed a small bouquet of wildflowers beside the broken marker. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "Now we'll keep ours." Professor Lawson carefully photographed the grave, surrounding landmarks, and Clara's map before recording precise coordinates for the County Historical Society. "This gives us everything we need to document the burial properly," he said. Her map was exact. Jacob looked across the neglected cemetery. "Nobody should disappear like this." Emma nodded. "Not after what he gave up." Within days, Professor Lawson submitted copies of Samuel's journal, Clara's notebook, the recovered telegrams, military correspondence, photographs of the grave, and supporting documentation to the State Historical Preservation Office. Historians arrived the following week to examine both the cemetery and the telegraph office. They measured the hidden floor compartment, documented the lockbox, inspected the journals, and verified that the physical evidence matched the written records. Every discovery strengthened the same conclusion. Samuel Brooks had not abandoned his responsibilities. He had carefully preserved evidence while trying to protect innocent civilians. Local newspapers soon heard about the remarkable discovery. Their first articles focused on the abandoned telegraph office purchased for $100 by a young woman who had recently been homeless. Emma disliked the attention, but Professor Lawson reminded her that public interest could help protect the site. Soon, volunteers began arriving almost every weekend. Some repaired broken windows. Others donated lumber, paint, lighting, or historical display cases. Jacob organized local carpenters who quietly rebuilt sections of the roof without charging for their labor. Neighbors Emma had never met brought sandwiches, coffee, and homemade pies for the volunteers. The abandoned building gradually became the center of a growing community effort. One afternoon, Olivia looked around the busy worksite and smiled. "A month ago, you were sleeping in your car." Emma laughed softly. "Now people keep bringing me casseroles." Olivia slipped an arm around her younger sister's shoulders. "Looks like this town adopted you." Emma looked across the room where volunteers carefully restored the old telegraph counter beneath Professor Lawson's guidance. For the first time in many months, she no longer felt invisible. While restoration continued, Professor Lawson supervised the careful return of copied telegrams to descendants whose families had been connected to the hidden messages. Some gathered together before reading documents that had remained unseen since the Civil War. Others quietly donated family letters, photographs, and oral histories to accompany Samuel's growing archive. Every conversation revealed another life touched by choices history had never recorded. Emma attended nearly every meeting. She watched elderly descendants wipe away tears while discovering why ancestors had escaped arrest, avoided confiscation, or quietly disappeared before danger arrived. Every recovered telegram restored another small piece of forgotten history. One evening, after volunteers had gone home, Emma and Olivia sat together on the restored front porch, watching the sunset settle across the empty road. "I used to think you pushed everyone away because you wanted to prove you didn't need anyone," Olivia said gently. Emma considered the words before answering. "Maybe I was trying to prove it to myself." Olivia smiled sadly. "You never had to." Emma looked toward the telegraph office behind them. "Funny thing is, I thought buying this place was the most desperate decision I'd ever made. And now," Emma smiled, "now it feels like it was the first good decision in a long time." Olivia reached over and squeezed her hand. Neither sister needed to say anything else. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt healed. Several days later, Professor Lawson arrived, carrying an official envelope bearing the seal of the State Historical Commission.
His usual calm expression could not hide his excitement. Emma looked at him nervously. "Is something wrong?" He handed her the letter. "Quite the opposite." Emma unfolded the document while Olivia stood beside her. The commission had completed its preliminary review of the evidence and announced that an official historical hearing would be held to determine whether Samuel Brooks's place in the historical record should finally be corrected. The hearing was held in the restored county courthouse on a clear autumn morning. Long before it began, every seat had been filled. Historians, archivists, local officials, descendants of families connected to the recovered telegrams, journalists, and curious residents gathered quietly, each holding copies of reports or newspaper articles about the remarkable discovery inside the abandoned telegraph office. Emma paused outside the entrance for a moment, taking a slow breath. Only a few months earlier, she had been sleeping inside her aging sedan, wondering whether anyone even noticed she existed. Now she found herself carrying a carefully protected archive that might restore the reputation of a man forgotten for more than 160 years. Olivia noticed her hesitation. "You ready?" Emma smiled nervously. "I don't think this is really about being ready." Olivia squeezed her shoulder. "Then just tell the truth. Samuel already did the hard part." Inside the hearing room, Professor Lawson carefully arranged copies of Samuel's journal, Clara's notebook, military correspondence, photographs of the hidden compartment, the preserved telegrams, and documentation from the cemetery. Each item had been authenticated during weeks of careful examination. Nothing rested on speculation anymore. Every conclusion would be supported by evidence. The chairwoman of the Historical Review Committee welcomed everyone before explaining the purpose of the hearing. "Today, we will examine newly discovered historical materials relating to Samuel Brooks, operator of the former county telegraph office during the American Civil War, and determine whether the official historical record accurately reflects his actions." One by one, specialists presented their findings. An architectural preservation expert confirmed that the hidden floor compartment beneath the telegraph desk had been constructed during the building's original period of operation and showed no signs of later alteration. A document conservator testified that the journals, telegrams, paper, and ink all matched authenticated Civil War materials. A handwriting analyst concluded that Samuel's journal and Clara's notebook were consistent with one another and had almost certainly been written by two closely connected individuals during the same period. Professor Lawson then approached the podium carrying Samuel's journal. The room became completely silent. "For decades," he began, "history remembered Samuel Brooks only as an obscure telegraph operator whose service ended without explanation. These newly discovered documents tell a very different story." He carefully summarized Samuel's observations regarding altered military telegrams, unexplained corrections, conflicting reports, and his growing concern that innocent civilians could suffer because of inaccurate communications. Rather than dramatizing events, Professor Lawson allowed Samuel's own words to speak for themselves. He then presented the recovered military reports describing communication irregularities during the same months. Dates, message numbers, and routing information matched Samuel's private notes with remarkable consistency. "The evidence demonstrates," Professor Lawson concluded, "that Samuel Brooks recognized serious irregularities in official communications well before investigators documented them." Next came the oral histories collected from descendants. Margaret Ellis described the family tradition, stating that an unnamed telegraph operator had prevented her great-grandfather from being falsely accused.
Members of the Harper family explained how an undelivered confiscation order allowed generations of their family to remain on the same land. Other descendants spoke quietly about unexplained warnings that had guided their ancestors away from danger during the war. None claimed to know every detail. Together, however, their stories formed a pattern that closely matched Samuel's journal and Clara's notebook. Emma listened from the front row while the evidence slowly assembled itself into a complete picture. Samuel had not acted recklessly. He had acted carefully, documenting everything he observed while quietly protecting families until he believed the truth could be proven. The committee recessed briefly before returning to announce its findings. The chairwoman unfolded a prepared statement. After reviewing the documentary evidence, authenticated journals, recovered telegrams, military correspondence, oral histories, and archaeological documentation, this committee finds no evidence that Samuel Brooks abandoned his professional responsibilities or acted with negligence. She paused before continuing. Instead, the available evidence strongly supports that Samuel Brooks acted under extraordinary circumstances while attempting to prevent communications he reasonably believed had been altered from causing harm to innocent civilians. Emma lowered her eyes as applause slowly spread through the room. Olivia quietly reached for her hand. The chairwoman continued reading. Accordingly, the historical record shall be amended to recognize Samuel Brooks as a telegraph operator whose personal sacrifice reflected exceptional moral courage during one of the most difficult periods of the American Civil War. Professor Lawson closed his eyes for a brief moment, visibly relieved. More than a century of misunderstanding had finally ended. The committee then announced a second decision. Owing to the extraordinary historical significance of the recovered telegrams, journals, and original telegraph office, the building would receive protected heritage status. Restoration funding would continue, and the office would become an officially recognized historical site dedicated to preserving the role of civilian telegraph operators during the Civil War. After the hearing concluded, several committee members approached Emma personally. One elderly historian smiled warmly. "Miss Carter, your decision to preserve this discovery instead of treating it as a curiosity changed American history." Emma shook her head gently. "I only opened the floor." "Sometimes," he replied. "That's exactly what history needs." Before leaving, the commission asked whether she would consider serving as volunteer curator once restoration was complete. Emma looked toward Professor Lawson before answering. He smiled and gave a small nod. "I'd be honored," she said. Later that afternoon, they returned to the telegraph office together. Volunteers had already hung temporary heritage signs outside the building, while neighbors continued repainting the porch railings. The office no longer looked abandoned. It looked cared for. Emma quietly walked to the old telegraph desk where Samuel's journal rested inside its protective display case, awaiting transport for final archival processing. Olivia helped Professor Lawson organize documents, while Jacob secured several new display cabinets along the wall. As Emma gently lifted the journal one final time, Olivia noticed something unusual. "Wait." She pointed toward the inside of the leather back cover. Time had loosened the lining slightly, revealing the edge of a folded envelope hidden within the binding itself. Professor Lawson immediately stopped what he was doing. Using a thin archival tool, he carefully eased the envelope free without damaging the fragile leather. Unlike the recovered telegrams, it carried no routing marks or transmission numbers. Across the front, written in Samuel Brooks's familiar handwriting, appeared only a single sentence. "To the one who finally uncovers the truth." Professor Lawson held the sealed envelope beneath the reading lamp, while Emma and Olivia stood beside him in complete silence. The handwriting on the front matched every page of Samuel Brooks's journal. Unlike the hidden telegrams, however, this letter had never been intended for a telegraph wire. It had been written for one unknown person living in a future Samuel knew he would never see. Gracefully, Professor Lawson slid a thin archival blade beneath the brittle seal. The paper unfolded with remarkable care, revealing several closely written pages. Emma took a slow breath as Olivia began reading aloud. To the one who finally uncovers the truth. If these words have reached your hands, then I did not return to finish the work I began. I regret many things, but I do not regret protecting those who could not protect themselves. The room fell completely still. Samuel's voice seemed to fill the old telegraph office once more. Many will ask why I failed to send the telegrams entrusted to my care. They deserve an answer, though perhaps not an easy one. Some messages carried ordinary news between loved ones. Others carried accusations that had been changed before reaching my key. Farms, families, and innocent neighbors had become names upon paper. Once transmitted, those names would have brought soldiers to doors that should never have been opened. Professor Lawson quietly closed his eyes while Olivia continued. I searched for proof before acting. I believed the truth would reveal itself quickly. Instead, more altered dispatches arrived. I could no longer tell which orders served justice and which served fear. At that moment, I understood something I had never learned from any telegraph manual. A message sent cannot be recalled. A message delayed may yet be corrected. Emma felt tears gathering as Samuel's words continued. Some will call me a coward because I chose silence. Others may call me disloyal because I questioned official orders. I accept both judgments if they spare one innocent family from undeserved suffering. Reputation belongs only to the living. Conscience remains long after reputation fades. Emma looked toward the restored telegraph desk, where Samuel had spent countless nights wrestling with impossible decisions. He had known history might never understand him, yet he had accepted that burden without bitterness. Olivia carefully turned another page. If Clara preserved these journals, then she has shown greater courage than I ever deserved from a younger sister. If she did not live long enough to see this day, then remember her kindness beside my own. She carried hope when I carried doubt. Professor Lawson smiled gently. He never stopped thinking about her. Olivia nodded before reading the final section. Should peace ever return, deliver what may still bring comfort. Preserve what cannot safely be delivered. Tell no story larger than the truth itself, for truth requires no decoration. If you have chosen to search beneath broken floors rather than walk away, then perhaps you already understand that the smallest acts of honesty often demand the greatest sacrifice. Complete this work not because my name deserves remembrance, but because every innocent life always deserved protection. The final sentence stood alone beneath his signature. May the last transmission I never sent become the first truth you choose to carry forward. No one spoke for several moments. Emma quietly folded the letter closed. She had spent months believing she was rebuilding an abandoned telegraph office. Only now did she fully understand that she had been completing Samuel Brooks's final message. During the months that followed, every recovered telegram found its proper place. Families whose descendants could be identified received carefully preserved copies under archival supervision. Some gathered around kitchen tables to read messages their ancestors had waited more than 160 years to receive. Others discovered long-forgotten explanations for family stories that had survived only through whispered memories. Telegrams whose recipients could no longer be traced remained preserved within the permanent historical archive, protected exactly as Samuel had hoped. Every recovered document was accounted for. None would ever disappear again. Restoration of the telegraph office continued with help from volunteers, historians, carpenters, and neighbors who had come to believe the building belonged not only to Emma, but to the entire community. The hidden floor compartment remained preserved beneath a glass panel, so visitors could see exactly where the iron lockbox had rested for generations. Displays told the story of Samuel Brooks, Clara Brooks, the recovered telegrams, and the quiet courage that history almost forgot. Emma accepted the role of volunteer curator with gratitude she struggled to express. She welcomed school children, travelers, veterans, and history enthusiasts into the restored office each week. Rather than speaking only about telegraph technology, she told visitors about responsibility, conscience, and ordinary people whose unseen choices shaped lives they would never meet. Professor Lawson often joined her, smiling as children practiced Morse code on restored equipment while listening to Samuel's story. Jacob continued helping maintain the building, insisting there would always be another loose board or squeaky hinge needing attention. Olivia visited nearly every weekend. Together, the sisters organized exhibits, welcomed visitors, and continued researching families connected to the recovered telegrams. The distance that had once defined their relationship quietly disappeared beneath shared purpose. One evening, after closing the museum for the day, Olivia watched Emma lock the restored front door. "Do you remember the day you refused to stay at my house?" she asked with a smile. Emma laughed softly. "I remember thinking I had nothing left." Olivia looked toward the glowing windows of the telegraph office. "Turns out you were standing in front of the place that would give you everything back." Emma looked across the quiet street before answering. "Not everything." Olivia raised an eyebrow. Emma smiled. "Something better." A few months later, a simple stone marker was placed above Samuel Brooks's restored grave. Clara's name was engraved beneath his, recognizing the promise she had faithfully protected after his death. Visitors frequently left handwritten notes folded beside the marker. Some thanked Samuel for choosing conscience over comfort. Others thanked Clara for believing someone, someday, would care enough to uncover the truth. Inside the telegraph office, the final display case contained only 3 objects: Samuel's journal, Clara's notebook, and the letter addressed to the one who finally uncovered the truth. Visitors often stood before that case longer than any other. Many arrived expecting a story about Civil War communications. Most left thinking instead about the quiet courage required to do what is right when no one may ever understand. Emma sometimes remained after closing, sitting beside the old telegraph desk as evening sunlight settled across the worn wooden floor. She would rest one hand gently upon the glass covering the hidden compartment and remember the hollow metallic sound that first caught her attention on the day she bought the abandoned building for $100. At the time, she believed she had spent the last money she would ever own on a forgotten ruin. Instead, she had purchased a second chance. Samuel Brooks had believed that some messages were too dangerous to send before the truth could survive them. More than 160 years later, his final transmission finally reached its destination, not through telegraph wires stretching across a divided nation, but through the heart of a young woman who refused to let forgotten voices remain silent. Emma had once believed homelessness meant she no longer belonged anywhere. Instead, an abandoned telegraph office had quietly reminded her that home is sometimes found in the work we choose to finish for someone else. And although the telegraph wires had long since fallen silent, the truth Samuel protected continued traveling forward, proving that the most important messages are not always the ones sent first, but the ones carried faithfully until the world is finally ready to hear them. And that brings us to the end of Emma Carter's extraordinary journey. Sometimes we imagine that history is shaped by famous generals, powerful politicians, or great inventors. But stories like this remind us that history is just as often protected by ordinary people who quietly choose to do the right thing, even when no one is watching. Samuel Brooks knew the truth might cost him his career. He also knew that a single false message could destroy innocent lives forever. So he accepted being misunderstood. He accepted that history might remember him as a failure because he believed protecting people mattered more than protecting his own name. More than 160 years later, one young woman who had lost almost everything walked into an abandoned telegraph office with nothing but hope and her last $100. She wasn't searching for history. She was simply searching for a place to begin again. Instead, she became the final link in a promise that had waited across generations. Emma never became wealthy from her discovery. She found something far more valuable. She found purpose. She rebuilt a relationship with her sister. She gave forgotten families the answers they had been waiting generations to receive. And she reminded all of us that even when life makes us feel invisible, we still have the power to leave the world better than we found it. Perhaps that's the greatest message hidden inside this story. Your circumstances do not define your legacy. Your choices do. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to know. Which moment moved you the most? Was it Emma buying the abandoned telegraph office with her last $100? Samuel's impossible decision? Clara's promise to protect the truth? Or the moment history finally gave Samuel his good name back? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I genuinely enjoy reading where you're watching from and what part of each story stays with you long after it's over. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about forgotten American history, hidden family legacies, and ordinary people whose quiet courage changed lives, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another journey into America's forgotten past. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today, wherever you are in the world. I hope you have a peaceful morning, a wonderful afternoon, or a restful evening. Until next time, take care of yourself, take care of the people you love, and remember that sometimes the most important message isn't the one that's sent first. It's the one that finally reaches the heart when the world is ready to hear it.